My guest at this time is Kevin Brock. He's a former assistant director of intelligence for the FBI, where he served as a special agent for 24 years. He's also been principal deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He's currently founder and principal of NewStreet Global Solutions. He's also the author of a column that appeared this week in The Hill entitled James Comey is in Trouble and Knows It. And so we'll be talking about what Attorney General Barr and his team will be looking into that Jim Comey might have reason to be concerned about. And Kevin, thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much, Greg.
You outline three different things here in your column that you believe Bill Barr and his team will be looking into, and we'll go through them one at a time. You write, the first will be whether the investigations into both presidential nominees and the Trump campaign were adequately, in Mr. Barr's words, predicated. This means he will examine whether there was sufficient justification under existing guidelines for the FBI to have started an investigation in the first place. How much of that is objective and how much of that is subjective? How much is clear as to whether an investigation should have been started in the first place?
Well, it should be 95% objective. The subjectivity comes into play as to whether or not the objective information rises to a level sufficient enough under the Attorney General guidelines by which the FBI operates to start a case. So that's what Attorney General Barr is going to want to look at as he pulls the case file, initiating the Trump collusion case, and really dig in and find out, all right, what were the facts that they were dealing with, and were they sufficient enough for the FBI under the guidelines and traditional protocols to start the case. Now, the problem for Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe and the team that they assembled out of the director's office to run this case is that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, has found that there was nothing there. So that naturally begs the question that the Attorney General wants to answer, and that is, if there's no findings of any type of collusion, as they say, between the Russians and the Trump campaign, what was the FBI going on in the first place to initiate the case?
What will they specifically look at? It's one thing to say an investigation is warranted, and then, of course, the investigation comes back not recommending charges. So what will they be looking at in those earlier documents to determine whether it was right to launch the Mueller investigation or the original FBI investigation in the first place?
It's a great question. So for the FBI to initiate a counterintelligence investigation, they have to have information that to at least start the case that reasonably indicates that someone is acting on behalf of a foreign power. Now, when that someone is a Russian, particularly a Russian intelligence officer, that's their job. So there's more than a reasonable indication that that person is acting on behalf of the Russian government, and the FBI can and should initiate counterintelligence investigations against Russians in this country who are conducting Russian intelligence operations. That's a no-brainer. Nobody has any problem with that. The special counsel in his report pointed out that the FBI rightfully initiated those types of investigations. However, when the investigation starts targeting what's called a U.S. person, a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident of the United States, then there has to be a little bit stronger indication that this person, this U.S. person, is acting as an agent on behalf of the Russian government. So you're going to want some facts that if somebody objectively looked at it, they'd say, yeah, there may be some fire behind this smoke. Let's go ahead and start at least a preliminary investigation, and that's how most FBI counterintelligence investigations start, as what's called a preliminary investigation or a PI, and they can under that phase of the investigation gather certain facts that will indicate whether there's a case there or not. Now, the ability to conduct or to take certain investigative steps under a PI is much more limited. There's only certain things you can do under a PI. You may not task existing sources or start new sources and target that U.S. person. You may not appeal to the FISA court to get a warrant to intercept the communications of that person. You may not pull their financial records, so it's very limited in scope. In order to do those things that I just articulated, you're going to have to move the investigation from a preliminary inquiry to what's called a full investigation or a full field investigation. And now you're going to have some facts that are closer to a probable cause statement, indicating that that person is acting on behalf of a foreign government. And in light of the special counsel's findings, it's going to be extremely important for the Attorney General to determine, did the FBI have those facts in place before they launched those investigative techniques?
Let me jump in with one other question before we get to the second point, and I hesitate to do that because the second point jumps off very well from what you just said. But I want to get your response to a question that the Attorney General himself asked in his Senate testimony last week, where he was still unclear as to why the FBI or the Justice Department did not contact the Trump campaign if they were worried about figures like Carter Page or George Papadopoulos. There were 3 different U.S. attorneys affiliated with the campaign, or former U.S. attorneys, Sessions, Christie, and Giuliani, so they probably could have understood the issues. Instead, they decided to launch the surveillance campaign. Any idea why they would do that?
No, and that's why he asked the question, because any veteran or experienced counterintelligence agent will tell you that the normal course of events, whenever an agent of a foreign power, in this case a Russian intelligence officer or somebody representing the Russian government, intersects with a U.S. person, the normal process would be for the FBI to go to that U.S. person and warn them, frankly, about the intentions of the Russian intelligence apparatus to gather intelligence inside this country. So give them a heads up. Look, you're intersecting here with a Russian. They're going to want to gather information from you, and you need to be careful. And by the way, will you cooperate with us if you have any further contact with this Russian intelligence officer, and give us what you learn so we can develop intelligence to counter those objectives of Russian intelligence? That's the way it's normally done. So Attorney General Barr, when he raised that question, is scratching his head like a lot of other people who have worked counterintelligence for a long time and saying, why wasn't the normal path followed in this instance? Why does there seem to be a jump to initiating a case and targeting U.S. persons like Papadopoulos and Page and others?
We're speaking with Kevin Brock, former Assistant Director of Intelligence for the FBI and former Principal Deputy Director at the National Counterterrorism Center. And the second issue is whether Comey's team obeyed long-established investigative guidelines while conducting the investigations, and specifically if there was sufficient truthful justification to lawfully conduct electronic surveillance of an American citizen. So I assume this refers to the FISA warrant specifically for Carter Page, a lot of which, depending on which reports you see, was based on the largely discredited Steele dossier. So what will be the barometer on that issue?
Yeah, and this is a key pivot point that has everybody's attention, obviously, because electronic surveillance of a U.S. person is an incredibly invasive investigative technique. I've referred to it as the nuclear option of intelligence collection. There's nothing that is more invasive of privacy than a FISA court-ordered warrant to monitor all of your communications, which goes beyond just your telephone communications. So the justification should be pristine, and we know from just press reporting about the dossier and, frankly, admissions coming from the FBI itself, the former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, that they relied heavily on this dossier that is clearly a political document. It should not have been the foundation of any warrant for intercepting an American citizen. That appears to be clear. So the Attorney General is going to want to understand what was the mindset, what was their thinking. Were they as fully disclosing to the FISA court as they should have been? And let's see, let's get the facts behind that, because if there were deficiencies there, we don't want to see them repeated ever again.
You then say the third will be an examination of whether Comey was unduly influenced by political agendas emanating from the previous White House and its Director of National Intelligence, CIA Director, and Attorney General. This, above all, is what's causing the 360-degree head spins, and that includes John Brennan, CIA, Jim Clapper at National Intelligence, and Loretta Lynch as the AG. And while in Washington, it's not hard to believe that politics would intervene on policy, perhaps even at the FBI, it also seems like it would be pretty hard to prove. How do you investigate this to get to an answer on this?
Well, we'd start with James Comey's own testimony before Congress, where he indicated a certain personal malleability in the face of pressure brought to him by Attorney General Lynch and the Director of National Intelligence, Clapper. In his own words, he stated that he had trouble resisting Attorney General Lynch's appeal to him to not refer to the Hillary Clinton email investigation as an investigation, but refer to it instead as a matter. And he didn't push back on that right away, as he admitted. Well, it's not the Federal Bureau of Matters. It's the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI doesn't handle matters. All they do is investigate. And then secondly, in his own testimony, he documented how he received pressure from the DNI to bring up the topic of the dossier to the president in a private meeting, and he did so. This is not FBI director-like behavior. The FBI's director's first role is to maintain the objectivity, the independence, the arm's length, impartiality of the FBI from other parts of the government that are intrinsically tied to politics. And he didn't show indications that he was strong in that regard, by his own words. We also have, as I think I point out in the article, indications that the FBI and the CIA shared confidential human sources, starting with Stephen Halper and others, possibly Joseph Massoud, Carter Page himself, this mysterious government investigator that portrayed herself as an assistant to Halper, as the FBI ran these confidential sources against George Papadopoulos. It just, to those of us who are veterans of the Bureau and the intelligence community, it looks like an entanglement between the FBI and the CIA on this matter. So my concern is that a lot of this may have had its genesis in more a political operation than a counterintelligence investigation. And again, that's a concern. It's not verified or validated at this point, but I think there's enough indicators for the Attorney General to pull that string.
Last 30 seconds here. Kevin, you point out that we're expecting in the next few weeks here the report from the Department of Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz. Do you expect a lot of these lingering questions and concerns to be addressed in that report, or will a lot of this come later from what the Attorney General is directing?
I think a lot of it will come out of the IG's report. Remember, the IG report is an administrative inquiry. It's not a criminal investigation. It does it can hold administrative penalties, but Comey and McCabe are probably beyond the reach of those at this point. But no, I think this is part and parcel of what's making them a little bit nervous. There'll be some findings there that will not support Comey's assertion that everything was done by the book. And then I think the Attorney General will take that and dig deeper.
And how long would an investigation like this take?
That's going to take some time. I think, it'll be a year before we get all the facts out on this, at least.
So a lot to look forward to in the coming weeks and in the year to come. Kevin, a lot of different moving parts here. Thanks so much for being with us and helping us understand it a whole lot better.
My pleasure, Greg. Thanks.
Kevin Brock, former Assistant Director of Intelligence for the FBI. He was a FBI Special Agent for 24 years and Principal Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He is founder and principal of NewStreet Global Solutions. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.